Last month, a hedge fund called Archegos imploded after making some very risky bets, and some of our biggest banks had loaned Archegos the money to make those bets, even though the hedge fund was managed by a guy who had already been charged with insider trading and banned by regulators from handling clients' money. Now, those banks suffered $10 billion, that's billion, dollars in losses as Archegos collapsed, with more than half the losses hitting one bank in particular, Credit Suisse. So, Vice Chair Quarles, your job at the Fed is to oversee the safety and soundness of our banks. And last year, you made the decision that Credit Suisse and a few other big foreign banks no longer should be required to participate in a Fed program that was designed to oversee the riskiest banks, the Large Institution Supervision Coordinating Committee, or LISC. Is that right?
Yes, although it didn't change the intensity with which
so you're the one who said we're not going to do that. So at the time, you justified dropping these banks from increased supervision on the ground that these banks, and I have it here, have significantly shrunk their U.S. footprint, and their U.S. operations are much less risky than they used to be, close quote. Your timing, of course, was impeccable on this. Just a few months later, Archegos blew up and resulted in billions of dollars of losses to Credit Suisse. So now, Vice Chair Quarles, before you told the banks like Credit Suisse that they didn't need extra scrutiny from regulators, before that, did you see any warning signs that these banks had some deficiencies in their risk management?
Well, the losses that you're referring to, the great bulk of the Archegos losses occurred outside the United States.
Are you saying that losses outside the United States can't affect operations inside the United States by these large multinationals? Surely not.
But we don't supervise their operations outside the United States. So their operations within the United States have shrunk, exactly as I said.
So you're going to stick with your original play. You know, in 2019, back when Credit Suisse was subjected to the Fed stress test, the Fed, quote, identified weaknesses in the assumptions used by the firm to project stress trading losses that raise concerns about the firm's capital adequacy and capital planning process. In plain English, the Fed said that Credit Suisse's models just weren't realistic. So I want to put the timeline together here. In 2019, Credit Suisse fails a test because it can't accurately project its trading losses. In 2020, you, Mr. Quarles, decide that Credit Suisse should be subject to weaker supervision. And then in 2021, a headline shows up in the Wall Street Journal that reads, quote, Credit Suisse had surprise $20 billion exposure to Archegos investments. So let me ask this, Mr. Quarles, do you now agree that you made the wrong decision to weaken supervision for a bank like Credit Suisse?
Senator, we did not weaken the supervision of a bank like Credit Suisse. The civil servants who are supervising Credit Suisse in our large bank and foreign bank operations
took it out of the program
would take issue with you.
I'm sorry, you can't just say you didn't weaken it. You took it out of a program that was designed to have enhanced supervision, saying you didn't need the enhanced supervision. That's what you said at the time, because their footprint in the United States had shrunk.
I didn't say it was supervision, ma'am. I said it was more appropriate to supervise them with other foreign banks of the same size footprint in the United States, which is what we do. Other foreign banks with similar prime brokerage operations that have long been supervised outside of LISC because their footprint in the United States is smaller. These banks are now smaller. The losses that you're referring to did not occur in the United States.
I
would not have been able to pick them up in LISC or otherwise.
I'm stunned by your argument that you want to say that there was no warning sign from the fact that $10 billion in losses could have affected what Credit Suisse was doing here in the United States. Look, we dodged a bullet with the Archegos collapse this time, but what slipped through the net by regulators to contain these losses when things go wrong was relatively small to what could have slipped through. It could have been an even bigger failure. And that is because instead of protecting the system, you spent your time at the Fed cutting holes in the safety net whenever you could. Your term as chair is up in 5 months, and our financial system will be safer when you are gone. I urge President Biden to fill your role with someone who will actually keep our financial system safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the pandemic swept across our nation, bank regulators worried about the health of our biggest banks. So the regulators were generous. They gave the banks all kinds of help. They delayed compliance for important regulations. They relaxed standards. They even allowed banks to avoid paying overdraft fees if their accounts at the Federal Reserve had a negative balance. Now, when asked why they were being so generous to the banks, the regulators explained that the banks would, in turn, help their customers. So how exactly did that work out? At the start of the pandemic, bank regulators issued joint guidance that recommended that banks waive overdraft fees for their own customers. In other words, if someone was laid off, for example, and bounced a check, the regulators recommended that the bank automatically waive the fees and let people get caught up without paying $35 every time they stumbled. The same way the bank could do at the Fed if it overdrew. Let me ask the CEOs of the 4 banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase, and Wells Fargo, the 4 banks that collectively manage tens of millions of checking accounts for customers. While you automatically and at no cost got complete protection from overdraft fees at the Federal Reserve, could you please raise your hand if you gave the same automatic protection to your customers and automatically waived all of their overdraft fees? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone raise a hand, and that's because none of you gave the same help to your customers that the bank regulators extended to you, help that the bank regulators recommended that you give. So let me focus in on this just a little bit here. Let me start with you, if I can. And ask the question about whether or not any of you didn't automatically waive. I just want to take this on down. So let's take a look at who actually paid these fees. According to Pew Charitable Trusts, it's disproportionately working people making less than $50,000 a year, African Americans, Hispanics, people who are struggling to get by. And how much did they pay in overdraft fees? They paid a combined $4 billion. So let me start with you, Mr. Diamond. You are the star of the overdraft show. Your bank, JP Morgan, collects more than 7 times as much money in overdraft fees per account than your competitors. So, Mr. Diamond, how much did JP Morgan collect in overdraft fees from their consumers in 2020?
Well, I think your numbers are totally inaccurate, but we'll have to sit down privately and go through that.
These are public numbers.
And I also want to point out we did not overdraft.
Can you just answer my question?
We
How
did
much
not
did
overdraft
JP
the
Morgan
Fed.
collect?
We did not overdraft at the Fed account. And at any request,
so you never,
said they needed,
I'm sorry,
they needed
Mr.
COVID
Diamond,
relief,
that was, Mr. Diamond, that was not the question.
On request.
You had an automatic protection. So I'm asking, you were recommended, the regulators recommended you offer that same kind of protection to your customers. How much, in fact, did JP Morgan collect in overdraft fees from their customers in 2020? Do you know the number?
I don't know the number in front of me, but
well, I actually have the number in front of me. It's $1.463 billion. That's nearly $1.5 billion that you collected from your customers. Now, do you know how much JP Morgan's profit would have been in 2020 if you had followed the recommendation of the regulators and waived overdraft fees to help struggling consumers? In other words, without that overdraft money, would your bank have been in financial trouble?
We waived the fees for customers upon request if they were under stress because of COVID.
You know, I appreciate that you want to duck this question. Do you know how much your profits would have been if you'd actually waived all the fees as the regulators recommended?
We waived the fees every time
The
a
answer
customer
is
asked us
your
to
profits
COVID.
would have been $27.6 billion. I did the math for you. So here's the thing. You and your colleagues come in today to talk about how you stepped up and took care of customers during the pandemic, and it's a bunch of baloney. In fact, it's about $4 billion worth of baloney, but you could fix that right now. Mr. Diamond, will you commit right now to refund the $1.5 billion you took from consumers during the pandemic?
No,
Right now.
no.
No, that's right. Over the past year, you could have passed on the breaks that you got from the Fed to your customers, but you didn't do it. Everybody else here, those other three bankers, will any of you agree to refund the overdraft fees that you collected? I didn't think so. So no matter how you try to spin it, this past year has shown that corporate profits are more important to your bank than offering just a little help to struggling families, even when we are in the middle of a worldwide crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator
Unanimous
Kerry.
consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business, and that upon the conclusion of my remarks, the Senate resume executive session as under the previous order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Almost exactly a year ago today, I stood here and called for Congress to take action to protect renters before the expiration of the eviction moratorium enacted during the early weeks of the pandemic. Today, like a year ago, we are only hours away from a fully preventable housing crisis. The CDC's eviction moratorium expires tonight at midnight, putting millions of families still recovering from the economic fallout of COVID-19 at risk for losing their homes, from losing the bedrock of their safety and stability. Right now, more than 11 million renters report being behind on rent. That is 1 out of every 7 renters. And people of color who have been hit hardest by this pandemic are disproportionately at risk. Nearly 1/4 of Black renters report being behind on rental payments. Last year, Congress worked together to account for that staggering reality. We provided more than $45 billion in emergency rental assistance. That money is now finally getting into the hands of landlords around the country. It's helping families who lost jobs get caught up on the missed payments. But the money is getting out too slowly. Some states and local governments opened their assistance programs only last month. Some hadn't spent a single dollar by the beginning of June. Now, that's starting to change. In June, states delivered more than $1.5 billion in emergency rental assistance. That money went to help nearly 300,000 households. But there are still billions of dollars to distribute and millions of families in need. We have the tools and we have the funding. What we need is the time. Look, I agree that the eviction moratorium is not a long-term solution, but let me be very clear. It is the right short-term action. It's how we keep families safely in their homes while states deliver emergency aid. It's how we keep families who are starting to recover from the worst economic crisis of their lifetimes get back on their feet. Millions of jobs lost, businesses still shuttered, and childcare for too many families a patchwork of uncertainty. The recovery underway in this country is historic, and it will continue, but it has not yet reached every family. But the need is not just economic. We are still in the throes of a public health emergency that is trending in the wrong direction. Cases of COVID-19 are rising, hospitalizations and deaths are rising. The Delta variant is more contagious, threatening to spread faster among the half of the country that remains unvaccinated. Needlessly evicting families would risk escalating our public health crisis. The CDC understood that reality when it issued an eviction moratorium in September. The agency was clear, and I want to quote the language they used. Housing stability helps protect health. That's right. Research shows that moratoriums aid in reducing infections and death due to COVID-19. And research also shows that when eviction moratoriums expire, there is an associated increase in COVID-19 and mortality. Yesterday, Congresswoman Cori Bush sent members of Congress a letter. Congresswoman Bush has lived through eviction. She has been unhoused. And I want to quote her letter. She said, "I know firsthand the trauma and devastation that comes with the violence of being evicted. And we have a responsibility to do everything we can to prevent this trauma from being inflicted on our neighbors and communities." Cori Bush is exactly right. My office has heard from so many people in Massachusetts who are terrified about the possibility of losing their homes. I know that each of my colleagues here must be hearing these stories. In every state in this country, there are families sitting around their kitchen table right now trying to figure out how to survive a devastating, disruptive, and unnecessary eviction. Congress has a choice to make. It is a privilege for us to represent people, and we have a duty to exercise our power on their behalf. Every senator in this chamber should be grateful that they have the power right now to keep families safe. My colleagues understood the stakes in March of 2020 when Congress passed the CARES Act, eviction moratorium, into law. They understood the stakes when we provided historic funding for emergency rental assistance. I urge them to join me now in continuing this life-saving protection as states distribute assistance to keep renters housed, to keep landlords paid, and most of all, to keep families safe. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Do you want me to do that one? Yeah, you did this.
So we looked at the data, and it's how much people owe, how long they've owed it, how old they are. And what we discovered is that $10,000 is just not enough help for enough people. That $50,000 helped us reach the point where we could cancel all debt for about 85% of those carrying student loan debt and help close the racial wealth gap the most. So it's a place where it's a substantial amount of debt relief, and works best for being able to help the maximum number of people get back on their feet. I think.
What about the, you mentioned that 85% of those who now have debt will be taken care of under this bill, under this proposal. What do you say to the 15% who wouldn't be included? And what do you say to all of those who have paid off their debt?
Well, let's do.
They paid off their debt, and now they're seeing other people get off without paying it.
Right.
And what message does this send to all future students who take on debt? Doesn't it send a message that you're not going to really have to pay this off because we'll let you walk away from it?
So let me start with the first part of your question. If I leave any part out, you can remind me. But on the 15%, many of these are higher income. Someone who's a plastic surgeon, for example, may have taken out a lot of student loan debt, but has a lot of capacity to repay the student loan debt. For those who don't, going through bankruptcy and changing the rules in the Department of Education so that they can cancel student loan debt as part of the bankruptcy process if they show that they are otherwise unable to pay, permits a more handcrafted approach for the smaller number of people who have very high debt loads and very low incomes. On the question about people who've already paid off their student loan debt, my answer is this is good for you. Student loan debt is holding back our economy. Our economy would do better if all of the people who have student loan debt were able to get out and start their own small businesses, able to buy homes, able to take jobs in public service, things that are denied to them when they're struggling with a load of debt. So overall, it's like everything else we do. I invest in public roads in South Dakota. I don't drive on them, but I invest in them because I understand that having an interstate highway system is part of how we make this country work for everyone. We try to create opportunity for everyone. And that ultimately that investment is what redounds to the benefit of everyone. The second part I'd say about that is that if we're going to take the position that if I didn't already get it in the past, you can't get it now, we never build anything. We wouldn't have started Social Security. We wouldn't have started Medicare. The whole notion is we're trying to move in that direction where young people can get an education without actually putting their entire future on the line, without, as Congresswoman Presley said, having to pay one full mortgage before they're dead flat broke and can start trying to build up some wealth to buy a home and save for their retirements. We're trying to move in that direction. Canceling student loan debt is the first step. The second step is making college debt-free for any student who wants it.
And I would just add, I'm
Please.
sorry,